Every hero needs a monster. This is not a cynical statement. It is, in fact, one of the oldest structural truths of mythology. The hero is defined by what they overcome. Without the dragon, there is no St. George. Without the Minotaur, there is no Theseus. Without Medusa, there is no Perseus. The monster is not incidental to the hero's story. The monster is the story's engine. The monster is the thing that transforms an ordinary young man, or a divine young man, or a semi-divine young man, which Perseus is, into a hero. But here is what we rarely ask when we are swept up in the narrative of the quest. Who chose the monster? Who decided that this particular creature in this particular place was the threat that needed to be eliminated? Who sent the hero on the quest, and what did they have to gain from the hero's success? In the case of Perseus, those questions have very clear answers, and those answers change the story considerably. Perseus was the son of Zeus and Danae. His mother had been locked in a tower of bronze by her father, Acrisius, king of Argos, because an oracle had told Acrisius that his grandson would one day kill him. Zeus, being Zeus, visited Danae in the tower anyway, in the form of golden rain, depending on the version, and Perseus was the result. When Acrisius discovered the child, he placed both mother and son in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. They washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys, whose name is not important to our story, but whose brother very much is, found them and took them in. Dictys's brother was Polydectes, the king of Seriphos. Polydectes wanted Danae. He had wanted her for some time, and she had been not interested. But Polydectes was a king, and Danae was a foreign woman with no power on his island, and the only thing standing between Polydectes' desire and its fulfillment was Perseus, her son, who was by now growing into a young man of considerable spirit, and who had made it sufficiently clear that he intended to protect his mother from this particular king. So Polydectes needed Perseus gone. Ideally, Polydectes needed Perseus gone in a way that looked like honor rather than disposal. He needed the young man to go away on a quest so impossible that the expected outcome was death, without anyone being able to accuse Polydectes of simply having had him killed. The Gorgon's head. Polydectes announced that he intended to marry another woman, Hippodamia, and that all the men of his court were expected to contribute a wedding gift. The customary gift, he specified, would be a horse. Perseus, who had no horse, declared rashly that he would bring whatever gift Polydectes asked. And Polydectes, who had been waiting for exactly this opening, asked for the head of Medusa. This was, from Polydectes' perspective, a perfect solution. The Gorgon was famously unkillable. Her gaze turned men to stone. She lived at the edge of the world, in a location so obscure that simply finding her required navigating challenges that would kill most men. And even if Perseus somehow reached her, the direct approach was suicidal. Look at her and you become stone. Polydectes had sent a young man to his death in a way that appeared, on the surface, to be a matter of honor and bravery, rather than a king's convenient elimination of an obstacle. This is the machinery behind the quest. Not destiny, not cosmic justice, not the inevitable triumph of heroism over evil. A king who wanted a woman, a young man who spoke too quickly, and a monster at the edge of the world who had nothing to do with any of this and would die for it anyway. But the machinery was more complex still, because Perseus did not go on this quest alone. He went with the help of the gods, specifically with the help of Athena and Hermes. Athena gave him a mirrored shield, This is the detail that everyone remembers, the shield that allowed Perseus to look at Medusa's reflection rather than directly at her, thereby avoiding the petrifying gaze. Hermes provided him with a sword of divine sharpness. Other divine gifts followed, depending on the version: winged sandals to carry him across the ocean, the cap of Hades that made the wearer invisible, a special bag, the kibisis, in which to carry the severed head without being destroyed by its still active power. Perseus received divine guidance to find the Graii, the three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, and by stealing their eye, he extracted information about how to find Medusa's location and where to obtain the tools he needed. So let us be precise about what the heroism of Perseus actually consisted of. He went on a mission assigned to him by a corrupt king who wanted him dead. He received divine equipment specifically designed to neutralize the only power his quarry possessed. He obtained intelligence through a form of coercion from three elderly women. He arrived at Medusa's location while she slept, looked at her reflection rather than directly at her, and cut off her head. None of this is meant to suggest that Perseus was simply a villain. He was a young man operating within the mythological system he was born into, doing what heroes in that system did, accepting the quest, using the available tools, succeeding. He did not invent the situation. He did not choose his quarry. He was, in his own way, a figure of limited agency operating within structures far larger than himself. But Medusa had even less agency. She was chosen for him. She was sleeping when he arrived. She had no warning, no preparation, no chance to apply whatever intelligence or strategy or dignity she might have brought to a confrontation, if it had been a confrontation at all. It was not a confrontation. It was an execution. And the tools that made it possible, the mirrored shield, the divine sword, tell us something interesting about the world's attitude toward Medusa. The world, in the form of the gods, decided she needed to die, but the world could not kill her directly. Her power was real. Her gaze was genuinely terrible. Her presence at the edge of things was in some sense a genuine force in the cosmic order. Even Zeus, even the divine apparatus of Olympus, could not simply delete her. They needed a mortal man equipped with divine tools to do it, because there is a kind of violence that can only be performed by human hands. This is worth sitting with. The gods equipped Perseus and sent him on his way. They did not go themselves. They provided the means and the guidance, but the act itself, the blade, the severing, that had to be done by a mortal. There is an old pattern in that, the institution that wants something eliminated but cannot be seen to eliminate it directly. The individual who is given the tools and the justification and the heroic framing that transforms a killing into a quest. The victim who is framed in advance as the monster, so that what is done to her can be called heroism rather than murder. Not everyone who performs this role is fully aware that they are performing it. Perseus may well have believed, genuinely and fully, that he was doing a heroic and necessary thing. The framing had been in place long before he arrived. Medusa was the monster. He was the hero. The myth told him so, and the myth was backed by divine authority. But the myth was built by people who needed a monster. As you lie here in the deep calm of this hour, let that thought settle. The heroes we celebrate are always operating within narratives that preceded them. The monsters they defeat are always named before the heroes arrive. And who does the naming, and why, and what the named one was before they were named, those are the questions that the heroic narrative tends to move past as quickly as possible.
Perseus received his gifts. He put on his winged sandals. He rose above the world and began to fly toward the edge of things, toward the ocean, toward the place where Medusa waited in her exile with her immortal sisters and her terrible eyes and whatever remained inside her of the woman she was before the temple and the crime and the punishment. She did not know she was coming. She was sleeping, some versions tell us, and the last night she would ever know was passing quietly over the garden at the edge of the world. Can you imagine what she dreamed? Did she dream of the coastline where she had walked as a young woman, the white cliffs and the dark water, and the salt wind bending the grasses sideways? Did she dream of the temple, of the cool marble, of the smell of sacred fires? Did she dream of her sisters?
There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists at the edge of things. Not the loneliness of a crowded room where no one sees you, not the loneliness of a city at night with its millions of lit windows, each containing a life entirely separate from yours. This is a different kind, older. The loneliness of a place where the world simply stops, where the familiar geometries of land and sky and human presence give way to something else, something vast and uncommitted, something that does not care whether you are there or not, because it predates caring itself. Medusa lived in that kind of loneliness. The ancient sources place her at the edge of the world in different ways, depending on which tradition you follow. In some versions, she is beyond the river Oceanus, the great encircling stream that the ancient Greeks believed flowed around the entire disk of the world, beyond which ordinary existence simply did not apply. In others, she is placed in Libya, in the deep desert, in a landscape of absolute inhospitality, where even the air felt wrong. In still others, she inhabits an island at the world's western rim, a place where the sun went to die each evening, and where night arrived not as a transition, but as a destination. All of these geographies share one thing: they are places you cannot easily leave. The exile was not simply a matter of Medusa choosing to go somewhere remote to live out her transformed existence in private. Exile in the ancient world, whether of mortals or of mythological figures, was a specific and terrible punishment precisely because it removed the exiled one from the networks of relationship, obligation, protection, and belonging that made life in the ancient world survivable. You were nobody if you had no city, no clan, no people to whom you belonged. The exile was cast outside the circle of human meaning. They existed, but in a diminished sense. They breathed and moved and ate, but they were not, in the fullest ancient understanding of the word, a person. For Medusa, the exile was compounded by transformation. She was not just cast out of the human world, she was made into something that the human world had every reason to fear. The serpents were not merely cosmetic, they were a barrier. They communicated at a glance, if you survived the glance, that this was not a creature you approached. They announced her otherness before she could speak a word. They prevented the possibility of ordinary human connection. A woman with serpents for hair cannot slip into a village market and buy bread, cannot sit by a fire with strangers and share warmth and stories, cannot approach anyone without their face registering the shock of what they're seeing, the involuntary lurch of fear, the instinct to step back or flee. She was placed in a geography that kept the world away from her, and then she was given a body that kept the world away from her even if, somehow, it had found her. The isolation was total, it was architectural, it was built into the very structure of what she had become. Except for her sisters, Steno and Euryale, the immortal ones. And this is a detail worth dwelling on, because in the sweep of the myth, in the rushing narrative toward Perseus and the quest and the heroic climax, the sisters tend to appear briefly and then fade. They are present when Perseus arrives. They wake after the fact and pursue him briefly, uselessly since he is already invisible and airborne, and then they vanish from the story. But they were there before Perseus. They had been there throughout the long years of Medusa's exile, and they had chosen to be. Think about that choice. Steno and Euryale were immortal Gorgons. Whatever the exact nature of their original mythological status, they were powerful, enduring beings who were not condemned to the exile in the way that Medusa was. They were not the ones who had been in the temple that day. They were not the ones Athena had cursed. They could, presumably, have lived elsewhere. The edge of the world was not their prison in the same way it was their sisters. And yet, there they were. There is no dramatic scene in the surviving mythology where the sisters make this choice, no moment where they debate it, weigh their options, decide. They simply appear in the story already present, already at Medusa's side, as if the choice had been made so obviously and immediately that it required no narration. Because of course it had been. Of course they had gone with her. She was their sister. She had been wronged, and the world had sent her to the edge of itself, and so to the edge of the world they went. In a story where almost every powerful figure fails Medusa, Athena, who averts her eyes and punishes the victim, the gods whose system produces the crime and then manages the consequences in the most unjust possible way, Perseus, who arrives equipped and sanctioned to kill her. In this story, the sisters are the only ones who simply showed up, who stayed, who did not look away. There is something quietly profound in that. The mythology, for all its complexity, does not make much of it. It is not presented as heroism or sacrifice. It is just there in the background, undramatized and uncelebrated. Two immortal sisters at the edge of the world, with the third. What did they do with the years? We can only imagine. Picture the landscape. Whatever it looked like, desert or island or the shoreline beyond the ocean, it had its own beauty, the harsh and absolute beauty of places that are inhospitable to ordinary life. Sunsets that happened slowly and with extraordinary color because there was nothing on the horizon to interrupt them. Stars at night that were impossible, the full unfiltered sky with no city light to dim it. The silence broken by wind and by whatever lived in that place, animals and birds that had adapted to the extreme edges of things. Medusa walked there. She would have. Whatever her internal life after the transformation, whatever remained of the woman she had been, bodies moved through space. Bodies observed the world around them, even if the world had given them every reason not to bother. That tendency toward noticing, toward being curious about the immediate environment, toward finding something worth observing in whatever landscape you find yourself in, that tendency does not vanish with the worst that can happen to you. It persists. It is stubborn and quiet and unkillable. She would have noticed the quality of the light at different hours. She would have learned the rhythms of the wind. She would have known after enough years every stone of that place, every variation in the terrain, every shift in the sound of the air before a storm. And around her, over time, in the versions of the myth that include this detail, the stone figures, the men who had come, drawn by ambition or greed or the sheer reckless bravery of those who have been told there is a monster at the edge of the world and cannot resist the idea of being the one to defeat it. They came, these men, with weapons and with intentions, and they had looked at her face directly in the way that the myth required, in the way that her terrible transformed eyes demanded, and they had become stone. What did Medusa think of them? In the versions where the stone figures are mentioned, they are presented as a landscape detail, part of the horror of the place, a warning to future visitors. But imagine Medusa moving among them, recognizing them for what they had been, seeing in their permanently frozen faces the last expression they had worn, surprise or terror, or perhaps in some of them something that surprised her, regret maybe, or recognition. She had not gone out looking for them. They had come to her, every one of them, across that impossible geography, past the obstacles and the distance and the edge of the known world. They had come specifically to end her, and she had done to them the only thing her transformation allowed her to do to something that threatened her. She had stopped them. This is not the narrative of a monster. This is the narrative of a survivor. She was not hunting anyone. She was not spreading terror through the populated world. She was not leaving her exile to trouble the cities and villages of ordinary mortals. She was at the edge of the world, where Athena had sent her, where the gods had placed her through the machinery of the punishment that followed the crime. And she was alive, damaged and transformed and isolated and alive, with her sisters at her side, and the terrible landscape of the edge of the world around her, and whatever inner life she had managed to build in the years of her exile. She could not run, even if she had wanted to, even if the transformation had made her presence in the ordinary world impossible. The geography of her exile was itself a kind of wall. The edge of the world was not a place you left lightly. The journey back across the ocean, back through the lands of ordinary mortals, back toward the world she had come from, that was a journey that required great courage or great divine assistance, and the gods were not in the business of helping Medusa. So she stayed. She stayed with her sisters and her serpents and the stone figures and the vast sky above the edge of the world. She stayed and she endured. And somewhere inside the endurance, somewhere in the long years of the exile, there may have been something approaching peace. Not happiness. The myth does not offer her happiness, but peace is a different thing than happiness. Peace is what you find when you have made a working accommodation with the shape of your life, when you have stopped fighting against the walls of the situation and started paying attention to the space inside them. She may have found that space. She may have had years or decades, or, in the timeless way that mythological time functions, something even longer, in which the immediate shock of what had happened to her had settled into the ordinary landscape of her existence. The temple, the crime, the transformation, the exile, these would not have gone away, but they